All right, I think it is time, and we only have 30 minutes, so I am going to jump into this. Let me pull up my slides, and let's go. So thank you, everybody, for joining. First of all, congratulations on reaching this milestone in your educational journey. I'm excited for the future that is ahead of all of you. Today, I want to talk about the student visa interview. I'm assuming most of you have already been accepted, or at least you're hoping to soon be accepted into a graduate program. And so the next big milestone that stands in your way before you can actually come to the United States and attend class and ultimately graduate is obtaining that student visa. And that may seem like kind of a trivial step, especially if you've already been accepted to a school in the United States. You might say, of course, I'll get a student visa. It won't be hard. But what I want to urge all of you to do is take this process seriously. Don't leave it to chance. And I'm going to tell you exactly how to prepare, or at least how to start preparing in the short time we have together. As an introduction, my name's Travis. I used to work for the Foreign Ministry of the United States, what we call the State Department. And I spent most of my career there working abroad at embassies and consulates as a visa officer. I've interviewed tens of thousands of visa applicants, and many of those were international students seeking that student visa to come and study in the United States. I've also managed a visa section. I've even managed a fraud prevention team. So now I dedicate my career as a US immigration attorney to helping applicants, first of all, understand this process, and then how best to navigate through this process and prepare for, hopefully, a successful interview. So today I want to talk first about what to expect. I think a lot of people go into the application and interview process quite simply blind. There's not a lot of, at least, correct information out there. So I want to dispel a couple of myths and rumors, talk a little bit about what to expect when you go in for your interview. I'll touch upon some changes and updates to student visas since President Trump retook office on January 20th. And then I'm going to give you some specific tips to hopefully help you prepare, again, for success. Now, we only have 30 minutes together. I'm going to try to save as much time as I can for questions. Apologies if we don't get to all of you. I will also share my email address if you want to reach out to me directly. So just before we begin, I mentioned I am a US immigration attorney, but the point of this session is not for me to provide legal advice. I would need to connect with you one-on-one, understand much more about your situation before I could even start to give you specific advice. So if you need specific advice, if you have specific complications, please reach out to an immigration lawyer. I'd love it if you reached out to me, but I'd also be happy if you just reached out to anybody that was qualified to give you the right advice, because this is important. So let's start by looking at the student visa process from a high level, sort of end to end. Now, I'm assuming that all of you are at least in the application stage, if not already having been accepted to a program, to a school in the United States. So you're now probably in the process of obtaining an I-20 form from your school. That's a simple, usually just kind of a 2-page document, but it's incredibly important for the rest of this journey, including once you get to the United States. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. But once you get your I-20 form, you need to review it, make sure everything's accurate, and you'll go online and pay what's called the SEVIS, or the I-901 fee. Your school can help guide you through this process. The next step is when your visa journey really begins. And that starts with filling out an online application form that we call the DS-160. This seems very complicated, but let me tell you, it is not. It really is just an exercise in honestly answering pretty simple, basic questions about yourself, your work history, your educational history, and your family. So I want to urge everybody to do this yourself. Do this on your own. Don't hire somebody to do this unless you really trust them, because once this form is submitted, you can't go back and change anything. And this is the beginning of what I commonly call an exercise in trust. Your visa officer is going to start your interview by reviewing your answers in this form. And if they find any discrepancy at all, they will probably conclude that they can't trust you, and they will pretty quickly deny you, and they may even complicate your future chances of success. So be honest and do this yourself, please. The next step is the visa interview. That's where we're going to focus today. That's the most crucial step of the whole journey. And then assuming, hopefully crossing my fingers, all of you are successful, the final step is traveling to the United States. Now remember, you can only enter the United States up to 30 days before the program start date listed on your I-20 form. And also remember to bring your I-20 form with you. You will actually have to show this to the official when you enter the country at the airport, or if you're driving in or even walking in across the border. Don't leave this in a checked piece of luggage. Have it with you, just like your passport, because you will need to show it. So with that, let's start about the truth about visa interviews. There is unfortunately a lot of misinformation online, in message boards, even so-called agents that claim to be experts in the process. Many people, and you may have already experienced this, many people will tell you to lie in the application or the interview. They may tell you that if you say a certain thing, that's how you will be approved. They may say to inflate your salary or your work experience. Let me tell you right now, if you take nothing else away from this session, you have to be honest. Visa officers are pretty good at spotting lies. This is basically what they do for work. And so if you're caught, even in what seems like a trivial omission or exaggeration, the best you can hope for is a denial. And so look, everybody has something in their past that may not seem great. Maybe you're embarrassed about it. Be honest. And if you explain yourself transparently and honestly, you are going to be set up for a much higher chance of success. If you are worried about something in your past, reach out to an immigration lawyer like me, and we can help you understand how best to navigate forward. Now, next, every time you go in for a visa interview, there's a record of that interview that's kept in the system. That means that if you're unfortunately denied, even though your visa officer probably won't tell you why you were denied, they will be typing in detailed notes in the system that justifies their decision. And every time you go to an interview in the future, those notes may be the first thing your next visa officer looks at. So it's important to put your best foot forward on your first interview. And if you have been refused before, it's important to understand how to address that. We'll talk about that more in a moment. Please speak English at your interview. The visa officer will want to make sure that you speak at least enough English at a basic level to understand what your teachers and professors are saying so that you can hopefully graduate. And don't rely on documents. You probably want to bring some documents with you, maybe to show loans that you've taken out or a scholarship you have or bank statements, maybe some photos, but these really should only be used in an emergency or if the officer asks for them. Otherwise, just focus on talking to the officer and introducing yourself and answering their questions. At the interview itself, and I will tell you from my own experience, I used to interview well over 100 applicants every single day. And while that is, maybe efficient, it's not the best policy because it meant that I only had maybe 60, 90 seconds, maybe up to 2 minutes with each applicant. That also means that I was pretty impatient. I often had to interrupt applicants to get to a question that I needed answered. And so what you need to think about is prioritizing what you want to explain to the officer to make sure you get the most crucial and positive details out as soon as possible. The other thing to keep in mind is that while you should maintain eye contact, if you can, with the officer while you talk to them, your officer may have their face buried over here in a computer monitor as they review details about your situation. That's okay. Try not to let it throw you off, and I would even say you should expect it. The officer can actually deny you. They can deny your student visa application for virtually any reason. And now, I don't want to say this to scare anybody, but it is true. The law requires you to demonstrate why you are qualified for the visa. And if there is simply just too much unknown or too much doubt or uncertainty, your visa officer is maybe even likely required to deny you. So I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. I had a lengthy slide here about changes and updates to the process since the new president took over on January 20th. Unfortunately, this is basically changing by the hour. It's an incredibly fluid situation. We're still waiting for clarity on potential additional bans or additional vetting and screening for certain countries. What I will say now, the only thing that is certain right now is that there will be more delays for possibly everybody. Even if you have a very straightforward interview, you're approved on the spot, it will probably take longer simply to get your passport back. There are going to be fewer people with fewer resources managing this entire process. It will probably take longer to schedule an interview in the first place. And then if you are put through some sort of what we call administrative processing delay, that will similarly probably take longer. So my advice to you is do not delay. As soon as you get your I-20 form, start this process. Assume that it will take potentially a few months to get your visa, so don't wait until the last minute. And remember that if you can't arrive at school by that start date listed on your I-20 form, maybe not the program start date, but certainly by the start of class, that's right to the left of that, there's a good chance that you will be denied because your visa officer is going to say, you've already missed class. I don't really believe that you can, proceed forward because you're already behind. So again, apply as early as you can. Now, again, I don't share this to scare anybody, but just to give you the reality on the ground. In 2023, a little bit more than 1 in every 3 student visa applicants was denied or subjected to a delay, which in many instances basically means a denial for students. Now, last year in 2024, that number went up to 41% of all F1 visa applicants. We don't really know yet what that number will do this year, but I'm a little bit concerned that it's going to continue going up. And so I want you all to understand how to start preparing for this process strategically so you don't fall into that 41% or maybe even more of applicants who are denied or subjected to delays, extensive delays, I should say. So first, what is the officer going to be wondering? What are the criteria that they will be evaluating to determine whether they can approve you or they should deny you? And it's actually pretty simple. Number one, are you actually going to the United States to study and enroll in a full course load, a full-time student? Number two, can you afford the program? And I know that there was just a session on finances. This is a key consideration in your visa interview. Have you made financial arrangements to pay for your school, your living expenses, and any other expenses that you might encounter? Now, this could be through a number of sources, maybe a scholarship, student loans, your own savings, sponsors. You need to be prepared to explain the arrangements that you have in place to establish credibly that you can afford the program. And then number three is a little bit difficult. It's what we commonly call having ties to home. And it basically means that you're not trying to get a student visa to permanently move to the United States. Instead, you're essentially going to leave the country after you graduate. You have something in your home country, or at least somewhere else outside of the United States, that's kind of pulling you out of the country so that you're not going to remain in the United States forever. And remember, as I mentioned earlier, the way the law is written, it's actually your responsibility during the visa interview to establish all three of these criteria. Because if you don't, if maybe you wait for the visa officer to ask you a specific question, or you just simply don't really explain how you're going to pay for your school, for example, you might face a rejection. So during the interview, I probably sound a little bit like a broken record, but it is crucially important that you are honest. Again, this is really an exercise in trust. The officer wants to make sure they understand and find everything you say credible. So be honest. And while you're being honest, be yourself, be personal, be authentic. And I'll give you an example here. If you're trying to explain why you chose a specific school or maybe a specific, degree program at that school, challenge yourself to explain this from a very personal standpoint. Every school arguably has good curriculum. Every program can arguably help you find a better career. That doesn't really tell the officer anything. They really want to know, why did you personally decide to travel around the world, live for a few years in a foreign country, spend a lot of money on a program? What is it about the United States, the state where you're going to be, the city where you're going to be, the school where you're going to be spending a lot of your time? What is it that drew you there and made you say, this is where I'm going to do it? And then I think confidence really comes from being prepared. And so what I want you to do, I think the best way to prepare is to be ready to volunteer an introduction. Remember, you have to establish why you are qualified for the visa. So think about volunteering where you're going to school, what you're going to study. But don't stop there. Continue to explain why you chose that school, why you chose that specific degree program. And then think about what is going to come after you graduate. Why is this degree going to make a difference in your life or your career? And then finally, how are you going to pay for this? And I will say that if you are looking for more information, I would start by going to our YouTube channel, ZF Visa. I actually just posted a video yesterday that talks about how to explain your financial arrangements. I should probably update this slide now. But take a look at our YouTube channel, because we offer a lot of free videos, free guides, and tips to help you start preparing for the interview. Once you're ready for the interview, and maybe you're in the middle of filling out your DS-160, I would then recommend that you review our online guidance at zfvisaguides.com. We have 3 courses for F1 visa applicants, starting with a DS-160 course that walks you through step-by-step how to complete this form on your own. We have a course that focuses on how to prepare for the actual interview itself. We offer examples of good and bad interviews, and we include a proven and effective method to help you communicate and introduce your situation and your plans to your visa officer. And then we have a complete end-to-end guide, starting with the I-20 and going through your eventual arrival in the United States. We include everything from the DS-160 to the interview, and how to avoid and address potential complications, like previous denials, family members in the United States, pending green card applications. And so I would recommend that you start there, and you should be sufficiently prepared after looking at our guidance. If you have specific questions, I mentioned that you really should reach out to a qualified immigration lawyer. Feel free to reach out to us at info@zfvisa.com. We are happy to work with you one-on-one, if nothing else, just to practice likely interview questions. But if you find yourself stuck in an administrative processing delay, maybe you have other complications like multiple prior refusals, or maybe you have a criminal record, reach out to us. We'll help you evaluate how best to move forward, and then we can practice the strategy that we recommend. So with that, I think we have about a little more than 10 minutes left. I want to spend that in Q&A. So I think Alina is going to be posting some questions here, and let's do it. So question 1, in the visa application, should we include all of our assets or just the assets that will be used on the MBA expense? Well, this is a good question. I think what you should probably do is first of all, answer every question very literally. You don't necessarily, for example, if a question says, where have you traveled in the last 5 years? You don't need to give 15 years of travel history. Similarly, there's not really a section where it says list your assets. Instead, you should be clear about who's going to sponsor your education. And then in the interview itself, you should be prepared to explain that with detail. Where does their money come from? What do they do for work? Or maybe what investments do they have that's enabling them to pay for your education? And then more crucially, why is this person going to pay for your education? Why have they offered to invest in you? That's very important. So let's see if we can go to the next question. Yes, it is. I love cars. Thank you for the question. I love car people too. Okay. Do you need to demonstrate funds only for the first year or also for the second year? Well, visa officers don't actually think about it this way. It's kind of weird. I showed you an example I-20 form earlier. It would take me too long to find that now, but on the I-20 form, it will show basically a line item total of how much your school and living expenses are projected to cost. And then it will show a line item total of your funds, whether it's loans, scholarships, personal funds. The officer's essentially comparing those two numbers, and they're making sure that, it's kind of a binary decision. Do you have enough money to cover that line item total expense? So that's really kind of what I would use as your guidance. There's no magic number. And we get this question a lot. Do I need a certain amount of money to pass my interview? No. You need to demonstrate that you have, in the aggregate, made financial arrangements to cover that line item total expense. So does it help with student visas if the applicant already has a B1, B2 tourist visa? It doesn't hurt. I'm not sure it helps that much though. Now remember those three considerations I talked about. Consideration number 3 is, are you going to stay in the United States forever, or are you going to, leave after you graduate? Well, if you've traveled to the United States before, there is an argument that, look, if you wanted to stay in the US forever, you already would have done so. And so since you left, hopefully within the time allowed, then it's more likely than not that you're going to comply with the student visa similarly. So in that way, it can help. It's not always a detail that I would offer first, because I think your officer is more interested in your status as a student. Okay, how should you answer the question, how will you be funding your studies if you're using a loan? So this is a good question, and I'm going to say for every question about finances, the short answer is answer it honestly. Really just think about what arrangements have I made, and that's what you should explain to the officer. Now, if you have student loans, let me be very clear, that will not disqualify you. This is very common in the United States. I used student loans to pay for part of my law school, for example. And so it's probably likely that your visa officer will have had a similar experience. However, one question they may be wondering is, okay, you're taking out whatever amount of loans to pay for this education. How might you repay these loans? And this is even more important if you are from a country that has maybe lower average salaries. If you're going back home to get a job and you're not going to make much money, it may be harder to repay a loan. And so be prepared not only to explain that you've taken out a loan, but you might also think about what you're planning to do after you graduate to repay that loan. Okay, so I already have an F1 visa that I got last year for a 3-month course, but the visa is valid for 5 years. Do I need to get a new visa? This is a really good question. First of all, I would say this is probably an area where you want to talk to an immigration lawyer, because the specific answer will depend on many specific factors. Generally speaking, my advice is to get a new student visa. And the reason is, on that visa stamp itself, I thought I had an example here, but I don't. There will be what we call an annotation that says both your SEVIS number and the school that you are going to. So when you arrive in the United States, even with a valid student visa, the Customs and Border Protection official, the passport official essentially that you talk to, We'll look at that visa. They may ask you a couple of questions about where you're studying. And if that's not all exactly the same, that may lead to more questions. And so it's generally the best practice to get a new visa if you're starting a new program. But again, that's not always true. So it's best to reach out to a lawyer and evaluate your options there. So, should we have housing organized before the interview? Maybe, maybe not. I will tell you that housing is not going to help your visa qualifications, but I would hate for you to miss a deadline where maybe you won't get, let's say, on campus housing if you haven't made arrangements in time. One thing that I always tell people is there is no expectation in the interview that you have bought plane tickets, maybe made hotel reservations for right when you arrive, or that you've already arranged an apartment or whatever housing you're going to live in. So don't do it just so that you qualify for a visa. I would do it more, by looking at the timeline that you're considering. The other thing to remember here is that you may not be successful in your interview. So consider, non-refundable deposits. If you're denied and you can't actually go to the United States, if you might lose a lot of money, then that might be a good reason to delay the finalization of your plans. Okay, so I filed a DS-160 a few years ago for a tourist visa. Plans changed, didn't go to the interview. Now I will be applying for an F1 visa. Will they see the previous DS-160? No. So the DS-160 is actually pretty complicated. When you file it, it actually isn't viewed by anybody until you appear for the interview, or maybe a couple days before you go to the interview, if you may go in for fingerprints a few days early, for example. Some people will submit multiple DS-160s because remember, once you submit the form, you can't go back and change any answers. So there is a way that you can submit a new form if you find an error, for example. And then whatever form you actually use for the interview is the only form your officer will see. They will not see previous drafts. They won't even see previous completed forms. And if you don't go in for an interview, it's not considered a refusal. If you don't appear for an interview, there's no record of that interview really having ever taken place. And so it is very unlikely that an officer would review a previous form if you didn't actually use it to complete your application. Okay, so many applicants from East Africa were denied. Okay, let me touch on this quickly. And this is very disappointing. We are seeing some alarming refusal rates from several African countries. And I think that this is due to a couple of things. One is just identified fraud trends. I think that there are some alarming trends of students that are simply acting on bad advice. It may not be that they are not qualified for a visa, but unfortunately, somebody has told them to lie about their work experience, or, we've even seen instances where an agent will loan a student a sum of money so that they can demonstrate that they have enough money in their bank account to qualify for a visa, and then they have to repay that after the interview. These are all big red flags for a visa officer, and they lead to more skepticism in general. So what I want to tell you, just tactically moving forward, because this is a difficult situation, it is actually more important than ever for you to be completely transparent, completely honest in your interview. And I honestly would recommend that you review our online guidance, because it's important that you show up prepared and that you have a strategy in place to effectively introduce your plans and your situation. Okay, I'm going to try to get through as many as we can. We have like one more question here. So if I'm going to work after graduation, should I mention this? Again, I want you to be honest. And this is a good question. I think many people in this session will probably have a dream of maybe securing a permanent job in the United States, maybe finding a company that will sponsor them for an H-1B. If that is your plan, great. I actually hope that you stay here and you use your knowledge to work here. But what I want you to explain in your interview is, what if that doesn't come to fruition? What if you don't get an H-1B? What if you don't make it through the H-1B lottery? What are your plans outside of the country? And that's what you should focus on. As you stand here today, you probably don't already have a STEM OPT position secured. And so while that may be great, that is not a guarantee. So again, focus on what you're going to do after you graduate back home and how you're going to use the degree that you obtained. And we may be out of time. Alina, I'll leave it up to you if we want to keep going.
Let's say we have one more question and then the session will end. Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, last question. And again, I'm sorry I didn't get to everything. Please feel free to send me an email if you have more questions. We'll do our best to get back to you as soon as we can. Okay, what are some of the material changes that visa officer looks at when going for the second attempt? Well, first of all, they're going to look at notes entered from your first interview. What was the reasoning that that previous officer denied you? And this is really unfair because that officer is almost certainly not going to tell you why they denied you, but they will type those notes in the system. That will kind of, to use an American phrase here, it will kind of poison the well. It's going to, put you in a negative position that you kind of have to explain your way out of, which is really hard if you don't know why you were refused. So a common question, if you were refused before, is, okay, look, you were refused last week, last month, last year, whenever. What has changed since your last interview? And so I want you to be prepared for that question. And I want you to think about all of the things that have happened in your life since your last interview. Maybe you've been promoted, maybe you've gotten a new scholarship, whatever positive detail you can share, you should bring up when you answer that question. And also look at our online guidance because we talk way more about this. So I think that we are at time. Thank you so much to everybody who joined. I want to wish you the best in your visa journey. This is a stressful process. It's a process that unfortunately very few people really understand. So again, reach out to us. We are happy to help you. That's what we do. That's why we do what we do. So best of luck to everybody, and thank you for your time.